Hello, if you'd like to see a more streamlined version of coloring, then you can stick around for this video if you'd like to see stuff that looks somewhat similar to mine. Also, my friend asked me for a coloring tutorial, so that's also why I'm making this video. When it comes to coloring, I kind of approach it in two different methods. They're kind of one and the same. That is either an additive or a subtractive method. Additive just means that I'm adding shadows to an existing form. If a form is pretty overexposed, it's mostly in the light, and there's like fewer shadows, then I add shadows to that. If the form is in the darkness instead and it's kind of underexposed, then I will carve out or subtract shadows from that form. I'll subtract this shadow and then I will add this shadow here. That's kind of the main difference. Honestly, when I approach coloring, I'm usually using a mixture of the two of these. Let's look at some examples here. So these are some photos from Pinterest that are just kind of illustrating scenarios where I would use an additive or a subtractive method. So on the left, most of these figures are in the light. She's a little debatable, but if we look at her face, undoubtedly, there is more information in the light than there is in the shadow, which is just along here. If we look at this model, a lot of her form is overexposed. So in this case, it would be easier to add the shadows to her than it would be to add the highlights, which is like everything. I hope this is making sense. If we look at these guys over here instead, this guy is there's no information whatsoever. He's just kind of totally, how do you draw an arrow in perspective? He's being totally lit from behind. Carve out the highlights from his shadow. This guy is a bit more up in the air, but this face is majority in the shadow as well. You could carve out the lighting from here. You could carve out the lighting from his hand as well. There is no really right or wrong way to approach lighting, but whenever you're looking at reference or depending on what kind of vibe you want to go for, you can either add shadows to the form or you can subtract the shadows from that form. You can carve out the lighting from that form. So let's say that we have a sphere. To make this visually interesting, I've made this sphere a flesh-toned color. And just to illustrate the same point twice, let's make two different skin tones. Now, with these two spheres, the very first thing that I do is I will create a multiply layer on top. And the secret to all of my coloring is that I use the color gray for my shadows. Usually when beginners first start drawing or coloring, myself included, they tend to have their shadows towards the right side of the color wheel. They make them super saturated, super warm. But once you start coloring more, you'll find that most shadows are actually very cool. They're very dull and muted, and you kind of want to be picking from the lower left section of your color box instead. So I just go straight to the left and I pick an exact middle mid-tone color, and I create a multiply layer, make it a clipping mask, and then in Procreate, when you're using the lasso tool, if you have color fill selected, you can tap the circle and it will fill it in automatically for you. Next, I make a Terminator. So what is the Terminator? It's like the transition color between your light and your shadow. Usually it's this pop of color and it's really nice to look at. I'm just going to illustrate it first, and once you guys see it, you'll probably understand what I'm talking about. I go along the edge of the form, and picking a desaturated orange or reddish color, I gently draw along the edge of that main shadow that I did in gray. I do the same for the darker skin tone. Let's make it more saturated. That's the Terminator. I select the smudge tool, medium hard brush, and I smudge it very slightly. This is basically it. There are other steps that I take, but this is doing somewhat of an additive method to my coloring. This is basically what I do, but I'm gonna go into more detail now. Okay, so let's do an actual demo using my OCD here. For demo's sake, I don't typically draw this way. I keep all of my flat colors separate, but just so this is not as complicated and you don't have to see me doing all of my layer management, let's just merge them all onto one layer. So I make a layer on top, make it a multiply, and then it's a clipping mask. It's clipping onto the flat colors right here. The first thing I have to do is determine the direction of the light source, that the light is coming from the right. And maybe this light is coming from the sun. It's a nice sunny day. Steven and Mitch are having such a nice time. So it's going to be warm colored light. It's going to be yellowish or it's going to be orangish. An important thing to note is that you don't want to use the same gray shadow for every single thing. You still want there to be contrast. What do I mean by this? So for Steven's hair, his hair is a pretty dark color. If I were to put this in grayscale, it's not as light as Mitch's hair color. I'm going to make separate multiply layers for like the different values. For Steven's hair, I'm gonna use a darker gray, and because the light is coming from this direction. For Mitch's hair is a much lighter color. We don't really want Mitch's hair to be the same dark shadow. That's what Mitch's hair would look like, but that looks a bit weird, right? Especially when he is much closer to the sun, so the shadow will be fainter. So instead, I'm gonna use a lighter gray color. That looks a bit better. You can work in grayscale if you want to. You can also choose not to. It's a good thing to constantly check your values. Something you can use to do that is make a color layer. You can make it white or you can make it black. And you can literally toggle on and off the grayscale so you can check your values. Now we're gonna shade Mitch's skin, which is the tan guy. It's really effective if you start with like big swooping shapes and then do a little bit of subtraction from there. You don't want to get bogged down by too many details. For Steven's skin, again, Steven has a lighter complexion than Mitch, so the shadow doesn't necessarily have to be as dark. So I'll move the gray up a little bit. Let's say like this. Steven's hair is also casting shadow on his face, so we can do some individualized shadows based on that. And then his nose is probably casting a shadow. His lips are probably casting a shadow. We can kind of extend the shadow down a little bit. Steven's hand is also like a part of his skin. Again, you want to start with bigger shapes, bigger shadows, and subtract or add based on that. Again, some knowledge of anatomy and form would be helpful for this. His knuckles probably won't all be in shadow. This hand right here is going to be mostly in shadow, and we can also make that a slightly darker color. It is completely occluded. Because we know that this part of the palm, it really like protrudes outwards, we can subtract from this. Like we can highlight that and we can carve it out. We can also carve like this vein out. There's a vein underneath the palm of the hand that will probably protrude a little bit. There's different things that we can choose to carve out, but you want to strike a balance so it doesn't look too weird. For Mitch's outfit, I purposefully have not added that much detail to their clothes. This was kind of an unfinished sketch. We know that this side of Mitch, this side of his clothing is going to be in the light, but this side is completely in the dark. There's no information there. The same goes for Steven's shirt. It is a light color. Again, if I come to my grayscale, his shirt is near white, and I'll just probably do the shadows, something like that. Again, you want to have big swooping shapes, and then maybe you could add smaller shadows based on that. I always try to keep my canvas zoomed out. You don't want to zoom in too closely because then you're going to get lost in the detail. We're going to move on to the second step, adding a little bit of a Terminator. Our Terminator needs to be a desaturated color, and because the light is coming from the sun, it's going to be pretty warm. To make it slightly yellowish, we're going to select the airbrush, soft airbrush, make it a huge size, opacity like 20%, and we're going to gently. And you can kind of see how this lights up the entire drawing. And sometimes I make the shadow like even darker, still desaturated but darker, and I come back with it along the edge, kind of restore some of that like darkness. If you want to add like an extra oomph, maybe I could make it super orange, make the brush smaller and make the opacity lower, and then I can fine tune it along these edges. It's time for the third step, which is blending. So again, I use the medium hard brush for blending. You want to find a good balance between blending hard and soft shadows. This shadow right here, this shadow definitely looks pretty extreme, so I'd want to blend this one out a little bit more. You can blend out the veins a little bit. Forgot to add a shadow for Mitch's cheek. This is a great opportunity for a nice little soft shadow. Some things that I do after I finish all of these steps to like just elevate the piece a little bit more, and this step is pretty important. Sometimes I'll come back in and I will make an overlay layer on top of everything. I'll pick the same desaturated orangish color, get a soft airbrush, make it super big, and make the opacity like 35-40%, and I'll put that airbrush over everything. Depending on like what color I go for with the overlay, it will produce like different results. Other times I will use that overlay layer and I'll turn it into a noise layer. You can add like a nice texture to it, or you could make it a halftone layer. The halftone is pretty nice. Other times I will flatten everything and then use a bit of chromatic aberration to make things more interesting. Sometimes I'll add a little bit of like lens blur around the drawing so your eyes kind of focus, but that's adding a little bit of gaussian blur to the edges so you focus on. Other times I will completely flatten everything and I'll begin rendering on top of that. Now, pretty quickly, if we were doing a subtractive method, I'm going to make a multiply layer on top of that, clip it, and again, It's gonna be in the gray, and we're gonna fill all of that in with shadow. I take the lasso tool, we're gonna begin carving out the light. So I'm gonna start with Steven's hand. We're gonna do Mitch's hair, move it away. We're gonna do his face. Maybe we want more of his face in the light so we can see his cute expression. Steven's face. Steven's face is going to be in even less light. If you don't have that much in the light, it's going to start to look a little creepy. The more information you give, the less unsettling it could look. And the next step is to add the Terminator. So we go into airbrush, get that kind of color, lower the opacity, and then we're gonna blend it out. Done. This time, let's make the overlay layer kind of reddish. And we can add another overlay layer on top of that, and we can make this one a bit warmer, like sunlight, a bit more yellowish, and we'll put it in this corner. You get the same result depending. I just leave it to you guys to experiment, have fun, and I hope this was somewhat helpful. If you'd like to see a tutorial on how to do different coloring methods or like different ways that you can do lighting, let me know. Thanks for watching and have a great day.